Well, welcome everyone. We'll still have some people arriving as we begin. I am Herb Simmons. I'm on the steering circle of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. This is our regular meeting. We meet twice a month. For those who have not attended before or who will be watching online afterwards there, I want to welcome everyone here. We have a very, very special meeting with two Europeans who have been involved in climate, ecological, and related issues for literally decades in the private sector, in the public sector, and every other sector imaginable, actually. And it'll be, I think, a very important and exciting afternoon, evening, or morning, depending upon where you are in the world. Today's meeting will be basically a conversation. I did not ask either of our guests to prepare anything, but just to come so that we could chat. I'll start off with some questions and back and forth, and then I'll turn it over to all of you to make your comments and ask your questions. We have Hans van der Loo, who basically has worked for Shell Oil, believe it or not, for many, many years in a very high position in Europe, and has also started an economic institute, and has worked as a consultant and in many, many endeavors. Those of you who have the invitation can see more detailed biography of Hans. And Wouter van Dieren, also from the Netherlands, has been involved with ecological and climate work going back many decades, and was in fact helped publicize and was involved in the creation of the formative Club of Rome report back in 1972, and has since started organizations, won awards, and at his ripe old age is still quite active. And the reason why we're talking to them is because they have established, along with some other folks, the Blue Cooling Initiative to promote temporary use of cooling. And they have now also in the process of trying to ramp up basically a coalition for climate cooling to cover the planet, something obviously of great interest to us, and that we want to basically see where they stand, where we stand, how we can work together, where we agree, where we disagree. I've had the privilege and the opportunity to have several lengthy phone conversations, video conversations with both of these gentlemen. They've been extremely intellectually stimulating and very hopeful in terms of our shared agenda going forward. So with that, what I would suggest is those of you who have questions can either raise your electronic hand and or put a question in the chat or a comment in the chat. I will do the best I can to follow everything as I guide the conversation along. And I also, because it is 11:30 p.m. In Europe and almost midnight, I mentioned to both of our speakers that we'll keep this to an hour or so that you can get to bed before it's too late. Hans indicated that he's had a particularly long day with his mother, which he may comment or not as we go along. But so we'll basically try to have as productive and as useful conversation for the next hour as we can. And those of us who want to stay on afterwards are certainly welcome to continue the conversation. With that, I would just like to start, particularly since we have some new folks. If you are new here, if you're not on our mailing list, please put your name and your email in the chat, and we'll make sure you're added to our list so you get invitations to our meetings and you can participate in the often lively conversations that go on between the 200 or so of us. And I also, for the benefit both of those who are new and also those of us who may not have looked recently or maybe at all, I'd like to take just literally less than a minute to read what the HPAC mission statement is, because I think this will be relevant in terms of the conversation that we have with Wouter and Hans. So basically, our tagline is cool, reduce, and remove to restore the climate. And then the four-word sort of phrase, later is too late, which we are borrowing from the Potential Energy Coalition, who did a extensive testing and survey a variety of messages in all of the G20 countries and found that later is too late was the most resonant of those messages. So we advocate the world community urgently come together to carry out an equitable, science-based plan of action that includes what we call the climate triad. First bullet, directly cooling the climate through sunshine reflection, ecosystem restoration, and other safe and effective means. Second bullet, accelerating emission reductions. And the third, deploying large-scale removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The goal, very importantly, of these actions, along with enhanced and transformative adaptation and regeneration measures, is to reduce the average global temperature increase to well below 1 degree C in the coming decades. Doing so will sharply reduce weather extremes, slow or stop the collapse of ecosystems, and help ensure a livable planet for humanity and the natural world. So with that, I'd like to start to ask the two of you, you can decide who wants to go first. We've talked a bit in our calls about, what is your sort of worldview in terms of what the theory of change is? What do you see are the key obstacles to implement effective cooling, and the sort of the overall big picture, and why it's important to sort of start with that before we get into any details. So I'll start with Hans.
Well, I think if you want to, I think it's correct, and thank you again for the invitation, Herb, to start with the larger picture and the theory of change. I think it would be better that we start with Wouter, because he has come to this topic in a very different way. Sometimes people compare us to Laurel and Hardy, me coming from industry and Wouter coming from the environmental NGO and of course the Club of Rome. On the other hand, we both very much agree that the topics we're talking about, energy and climate, are two sides of the same medal. So that is why we actually feel very, very close, even to the non-initiated. We seem to be far apart. And maybe one final sentence before I hand over to Wouter to start to develop the shared theory of change is that in the nearly 10 years that I worked in Brussels, I've been mounting many multi-stakeholder joint advocacy platforms, because that is a very effective way to move things. I don't use the word lobby, but that's what I'm talking about. And I was always seen as the most NGO-friendly industrialist. And a Norwegian representative from Bellona, which is a Norwegian NGO that you may know her because you have passed emission removal and therefore also CCS in your objectives. You may have heard of Bellona. They were an NGO and they were seen as the most industry-friendly NGO. And so when we talked during the week and there were some misunderstandings, then Paul and I would call again in the weekend and he would tell me, if you do not get that company reined in, Hans, this whole thing will explode. And I would say, well, if you do not get that NGO reined in, it will explode as well. So what are we going to do? And then we sort of put plasters on the wounds and moved on. But let me hand over to Wouter, because he's been at the Club of Rome report Limits to Growth 50 years ago now, 52 years ago now. And he will share the theory of change. I know we'll talk about Habermas and others, but I would over to you, Wouter.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can.
Okay. Thank you. We have only an hour, as Herb said, and I will try to be very brief, but indeed, I have a lot of experience in changing programs, changing paradigms and all that. The Club of Rome, of course, was a shot in the face of past more economic growth. Suddenly, Jay Forrester, Dennis Meadows from MIT said to the world, there is an end to everything, limits to growth. And they calculated with their World 3 model that by 2020, 2050, growth would come to an end. And I filmed them in Boston. I was a television producer at the time, science editor of Dutch television and German television. And I filmed them, and I recall the words by Jay Forrester, this growth is going to stop. It will stop. And the only question is how. And last week I had a call with Dennis Meadows, who is the main author of Limits to Growth. Dennis is very pessimistic. He said the world has lost its ability to organize itself on a global scale. That is not my opinion. I think it's still possible. The theory of change does not exist, but there are various sociologists. The most famous one is a German Habermas and a Frenchman, Michel Foucault. Their point is the following. You must have, I will go point by point through about 10 different steps that you have to take. Is that okay? So theory of change is about, first of all, you must have a position, theory. You must have something that has meaning, and you must have goals. Lots of people don't understand that before you do anything, you must ask those questions. That's the first step. Then the second step is something that was very, very well positioned by Mahatma Gandhi, who said you have to be impeccable. The industry may lie, governments may lie, the NGOs may not lie, but if you want action on this scale, you must be impeccable. That's no longer true. NGOs don't lie really, but they miss the point. They no longer have the knowledge. The third point, of course, is very obvious, not very new, but leadership. You cannot expect the world to follow you if there's not some leadership. It doesn't need to be a hero, but it has to be an identifiable point of view, a lighthouse at the horizon. This is where we go. I am the captain on the bridge. Then there has to be a group. It's not that you can do these things alone. Then when you think you can do these things alone, then you're a messiah, and you have to walk in the desert and get lost in the desert. The messiah is always a lonely figure, but in a process as this one, you need a group. You are not alone. Then already also Mahatma Gandhi, there has to be a constituency. If you don't have a constituency, you will lose. So there has to be an army behind you. These are the 3 points by Gandhi: constituency, impeccable, and non-violence. The last one is, of course, the best known. Then, of course, there has to be a certain direction. Where is the horizon? Where is the lighthouse? We see now in our climate discussions a few who have a certain direction, especially those who now fight our kind of approach and those who take big industry to court. That is a direction. There are now about 1,700 court cases in the world about climate, and most of them are very aggressive, and most of them try to knock down big industry and fossil industry and all that. But there is a direction. When I try to convince industry, for instance, last day we had a big meeting with the largest German energy corporations, RWE, and the question at the table was, why do the NGOs have a direction, and why does big industry has no direction? Because they are afraid and they are cowards. Then there has to be a program. If you don't have a program, if you chit-chat all the time, discuss and debate, as we have seen in our group over the last 2-3 years, if everybody talks in about different subjects and disagrees all the time, that doesn't work. There must be a common program. There must be a direction, in spite of the fact that when you're uncertain about directions and about the reality of science, there has to be a program, including the preparedness to make mistakes. And then, of course, some of the last ones are skills. If you don't have the skills about lobbying, Hans has been a very prominent lobbyist in Brussels. I have organized Limits to Growth worldwide in terms of spreading the news. We sold 12 million copies in 52 languages. We had 800,000 articles and movies and films or whatever. So if you don't have a program, you don't support that by skills, and the skills are about politics, journalism, so writing, speaking, and all that. You cannot stutter your way to success. That's impossible. And you cannot stutter your way if you're not able to speak several languages. I give you the example of Friends of the Earth. They are now fighting big industry, and they win because big industry doesn't know how to defend itself and doesn't follow this kind of programs. In order to get somewhere, we have proposed already since 1, 2, 3 years to David King and to the others, please, let's organize another IPCC. And we call it now International Climate Cooling Coalition, ICCC. The start will be in Brussels, the 24th of June in Brussels, with a very small group of people, only 25 or perhaps 40, including big money. We have invited key persons. Most of them can come, and it's on the side of the philanthropists who are there. They organize VIPs, people with money and influence, and we organize the experts. Today I learned that Jim Hansen will possibly also be there, but certainly David King. So it's about 10 steps, and altogether they create power. If you don't want, if you continue your internal debates, if you think that your publications will work, that's not true. Publications, but if you have lots of publications and they don't represent a common goal, then you don't gain power. So it has to be, there has to be one direction. I see about 25 different technologies and theories. Nobody in the political sphere, in the decision world, will follow that. They won't. They will follow 1 or 2 or 3 heroes or possible successes. So there has to be a unification of theories. And that, in short, is how it works, Hans.
Yes, indeed. I agree with that. And of course, it's always risky to be, I take it, well, I know a few of you are not as a background of scientist. I have worked in my life with people from the R&D departments that I worked with. Even McKinsey had a research department. We worked very closely together with Johan Rockström when I was at the WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But actually, in the last couple of years, I've come to understand why the term ivory tower exists.
Yeah,
because many of the scientific papers that you know from Latham and Toomey date back from the 70s. And so I thought, well, if many of the techniques that we're talking about now and that are being discussed in the group were already known in the 70s, why has not much more happened? And end of last year, something happened with a person whose name I will not name, but he complained that there was an NGO in Germany. Sorry, it was not November last year, it was the year before. It was because it was still Angela Merkel who was the German Bundeskanzler. And he actually called me and said, well, there's a German NGO who are saying things that is not correct. They should stop doing that. And then he called me and said, can you, Hans, please call Angela Merkel and tell her to tell this NGO to stop it. Now, I was very surprised that anyone serious in their minds could ask a question like that. For 2 reasons. First of all, I do not happen to have the mobile number of Angela Merkel, but I have somebody who works very close to her. But even if I could get that message to her, a democratically elected leader cannot tell an NGO to stop talking about something. That's not how reality works. And so then I started to understand why also cooperation between academic institutions sometimes goes very difficult, because sometimes they're both talking from their towers, but they're not really communicating. They're merely broadcasting and communicating past each other. And I think one of the key things of the power, and notably the impact, because impact is both gravity and direction. So power and direction, that is impact. Empathy and also patience, including not only patience as far as time is concerned, but also the patience to work with people who are not even half as clever as you are, because they do have votes. Because in the current democratic system that we have, we count noses. The original democracy that was invented in Greek was very different. It was only man that could vote. I do not promote that, but that was the system there. and you actually had votes in accordance with how much tax you paid. So actually, it was a kind of plutocracy. Now, I don't think that the democracy that we have today is very much better, because I often compare ourselves with a minority interest group of the currently living. Now, of course, if it's about the color of the lines on the road, whether we want to have that green or red or purple with white stars, we can decide that, because we have to repaint it anyway every 5 years. But the topics that this group is talking about, where does the minority interest group of the currently living think they have the legitimacy from to actually decide things that are disadvantageous to future generations, because we do not want to make sacrifices now? But
Yes.
we have to accept that it's probably the best thing we have, and I don't know a better system. But in that system, you have to realize there are people that are not well informed, and you have people who are maybe not as smart as you are. So to explain,
Hans, I'm sorry, Hans, I'd like to see if I could refocus the conversation a bit, just because of time. Appreciate what you're saying, but what I'd like to ask the two of you is, you're just at the beginning of creating the ICCC. You obviously given a lot of thought to it. You're in the process very carefully of organizing people who could fund this and support this and make this a going concern that will have a real impact, or you wouldn't be doing it. So I get my question to you is, to both of you, is if you came back here 3 years from now and gave us a report on the successes of the ICCC, what would that look like? What do you see, in terms of theory of change, what do you see the ICCC doing that will move the needle in terms of bringing the world back into the energy balance that we all recognize is necessary to avoid catastrophe?
I think very much. You said early on did you call it the Articles of Incorporation of HPAC? The 3 points that you talked about, like solar radiation reflection, restoring ecosystems, accelerating reduced emissions, and promote emission removal. Those things would be happening because people understand them, and I very much like, Herb, the order in which you put them, and I suspect that. I saw Robert Tulip on my left, that he may be behind that, because he, to me, it was a bit of an epiphany in Cambridge when he said longer term, cooling is no substitute for emission reduction, but short term, it's the other way around. Cooling, emission reductions is no alternative for cooling. And so I appreciate it very much, Robert. I see him putting up his hand. Maybe, Herb, can we let Robert react to this? Because I put a spotlight on him, but it was only to thank you, Robert, but please, I see your hand up.
I really want to, before we do that, I want to push you a little bit, because you said, well, in 3 years, you'd like to see the three things that we said happen. So my question is, how are they going to happen? What is the ICCC? What is your secret sauce that you're willing to tell us? What is your strategy? What will you do differently than what has occurred or not occurred in the last few years to advance it? And, and I don't know how detailed you've gotten, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but do you see the lever being through the IPCC or through the COP or through G20, or have you even gotten to that point? What's sort of the institutional, and I part of the reason I ask you that is because I know Hans and both of you have spent so much time in conversations with key leaders of institutions all over Europe and the world, feeling them out, hearing what they have to say, testing your messages with them. So I think the two of you, more than most anyone, have the best feel imaginable for what the sort of the gestalt is out there, what the attitudes are. And so that's really my question to the two of you. How are you going to make that happen?
Okay,
then we're going to ask, how can we help? But first, let's just say, how are you going to make that happen?
Well, I refer to several campaigns similar as these, and I give you an example. When we first met with David in Cambridge and Stephen Salter, Stephen said, can you please call the same Angela Merkel in Germany because you know her and tell her that she's wrong. And we told Stephen, no, you have to have a program, because indeed, as Hans said, if you try to ring her, she doesn't pick up the phone. When will she pick up the phone? When you have the program, when you have your system in place. The system in place is as we did it with limits to growth and various debates in Germany and in all of Europe about packaging and water management and the ocean and all that. The system is always that we had an enormous science program in terms of refining the theory and ending with certain conclusions. I just noted someone wrote, how do you get 25 different technologies into one that makes sense and can be turned into a success? Well, information and science go first. You have to get your thing in order. If I look at all the discussions that come by every day, excellent pieces I read, but never I see a complete story. I don't see it. Why did we write Limits to Growth? And why did we copy it 7 times, redoing it and recalculating it? Because you want that to be straight and clear to everybody, and no bypasses and no further, lots of discussions, but no bypasses. So there is a straightforward key. It has to be in line with everybody's expectations and dreams or whatever. Then, of course, in 3 years from now, we would have a very good story altogether. And it would start now. It has started with all the debates that are going on to bring them all together and find out where the direction is. Then there has to be a excellent idea, an inventory of governance. We have come across in our meetings in Cambridge and in The Hague and in Brussels the question about governance, and they chat and they say we have to visit the Inuits and the Eskimos, and we have to talk to those and those and those, but there is never an ambassador who represents an ICCC or an whatever organization and talks to the Sami and say this is where we are and this is where we go. So it has to be a way. It cannot be random. It cannot be individual. It has to be a program. And it has to be an inventory of all the key players. In Germany, we organized 30 years ago, Ernst von Weizsäcker and myself, we organized the first debate between the Greens, industry and government. And we identified 500 key stakeholders. And that is the next most important step. You have to organize the stakeholders all together. We brought them together in workshops and conferences. When people meet, when they get together, they always are inclined to find a sort of a consensus. So that's a part of the game, a full program about organizing the group and organizing the constituency and organizing the common goals. Then, of course, people ask us, we were yesterday or the day before yesterday with a former minister who is now in charge of related programs. And he said, I want to know the technology. And if we tell them that there are 25 technologies, then he gets bored because he cannot understand how to make a choice. So the choices have to be made by us. That there has to be a choice about what is, in fact, the next step in terms of images and constructions and technologies and practices. Then, of course, we would organize financing. In the Brussels meeting, we tried to get the first financing. We see all the time. We had a friend of Jim Henson, Leon Simmons, whom you know, and he said we had talked to Jim, and Jim wants to come to Brussels and ask for money. But if the individuals ask for money, they compete, and then nothing will happen. Of course, individually you can collect money, but if you don't do it as a collective, then all the big money goes more or less nowhere. So we should organize financing, and I have a full picture of what it is like. I give you an example. The vice chairman of the European Central Bank, Frank Elderson, is a good friend. and he is very interested. And he said, how are we going to finance the hundreds of billions? And we said to Frank, there has to be a part of the campaign and a part of the ICCC program, a fantastic group of intellectuals who understand this kind of financing, because we don't know how to organize hundreds of billions. So the complete picture is about information, science, governance, technology, and financing. And if these 5 chapters are well ordered, then that's where we are in 3 years' time.
Well, that's a very ambitious scenario that you paint. And I guess the follow-up question to that is, so do you see the ICCC? I mean, in order to accomplish that, I would think you would need a very extensive staff of quite a few people, and maybe, if not tens of millions of dollars, multi-millions of dollars, to be able to to carry that out, particularly since right now there are, like, the non-use agreement that was proposed and signed by academics that now has 1,900 institutions from all over the world that have committed to not use, non-have patents, and many other negatives about geoengineering. So I guess my question is, do you see, I mean, the name is, your name is Coalition. Do you see this as an association of groups or as one group? And then what is the role that you would see, or you would suggest we think about seeing, for HPAC as part of this? And after that, and after Hans's response, I'll turn it over to the audience and get some questions and dialogue.
You want to have a first go,
Hans?
You want to have a first go? I will tell a bit about my experience with multi-stakeholder joint advocacy coalitions, because that is what this is going to be. But Wouter, you go ahead first.
Well, ICCC would be an organization of a few hundred. You should have a target, let's say 600,000 people and institutions, both. It's individual membership and it's institutional membership. And there is, of course, a staff, but it's not a staff of tens of people. That's not necessary. You have to realize that the big successes they have now achieved, the non-use agreement, it's governed by a group of only 3 people. And but because they have funds from the university, they can get it organized. But don't be mistaken. I've looked at the list of the 1900. I thought it was 1700. And many organizations are 1 or 2 people, but that's enough. If you have a common goal and a common negative goal, that's very motivating, because they can hold evil. And to stop evil, that's the common goal. And you need very few people. Once you have this in place, once you have a view on what it should be like, and everybody understands, then you don't need millions and millions. The first goal that we want to achieve in Brussels is get about 5 million. That's the start. And we already had 3 million raised a few years ago for one of the technology programs. So big staffs are not the point, but the discipline of the organization is the point.
I think
Hans, you want to add anything? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned the list of organizations you mentioned, like the G20, the G7, the Arctic Council, et cetera. Those indeed would be the organizations that we would contact. But the secret is not in which organizations do we need to contact, because anyone can find that out. The secret will be in the composition of the coalition. Because when I worked in Brussels, yes, indeed, I could get every door open. But by the way, the head of Greenpeace could get every day open, of course, door open as well, because that would be very difficult in democracy if those would stay close for them. But I also knew that if a single unit goes to a decision maker, they will never adopt exactly what they propose. Because, how could, say, the US government, or how could the European Commission copy the Greenpeace way of doing it and make that European or US policy? That doesn't work. By the way, the same works if it cannot be the Shell way of doing things or the McKinsey way of doing things. But when I started innovating and experimenting with multi-stakeholder joint advocacy coalitions, actually a competence that I acquired in the Air Force came in quite useful. I learned, amongst others, to read upside down and to look at your eyes to know where you are looking at the piece of paper that I put in front of your eyes. And so what we typically would do, we'd have an A4 sheet, And so the top half would have many logos of universities and regions and companies and NGOs, so the members of our coalition. And then the summary of what we ask would be in the lower half of that A4. And so we put that to the people that we were lobbying or contacting, engaging. And I would look at their eyes. And if they were reading the text, you could see the eyes going left to right, but they didn't. They were really jumping ahead and they were never going that way around. And at several points in time, they actually asked, so you all agree with whatever is written down here, not only on page 1, but also page 2 and 3? And we all nodded. And then there was this atmosphere, okay, where do I sign? Because basically we had done their job. We had actually found a platform and a proposition that was acceptable in a broad sense. So it was universities, it was regions, it was companies, it was NGOs, which is normally the work that they have to do. So the ICCC will be a very broad coalition. So you know, Herb, that many of those 1900 NGOs, many of them claim that indigenous people do not want this. Well, tomorrow at 5 o'clock, I'll be talking to the executive council member of not the ICCC, but the ICC, which is not the International Criminal Court, but the Inuit Circumpolar Convention. And I know already what the person I'm going to talk, because I briefly spoke with him in Brussels. He said, we very much favor what you do, particularly things like ice shelf thickening, like Arctic reflections or marine cloud brightening. So it would be very powerful to have them in there. Now, what do you do when we have them in there? Well, they're based in Ottawa. And guess what government is represented in Ottawa? Canada. Canada is, after Russia, the most important member of the Arctic Council. So you can see where we're going there with also a problem state, in the sense that Switzerland, I wrote it up, but I don't know whether everyone has seen the email. Switzerland is a country that has a long tradition of referenda. Last year in May, there was a referendum in which a small minority, but it was a majority, of Swiss said, well, we do not want to have any tighter rules. So it's very difficult for the Swiss government to go back after having been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights in February to say, well, we are going to put on new legislation, even though only 9 months ago you told us you didn't want that, because that doesn't work in a confederation. So they're now between a rock and a hard place. And this actually opens an opportunity for us, because on the one hand, they must comply with the ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, because no appeal is possible. They cannot upfront their own population, because then they would dishonor the whole principle of the referenda. So if they could prove that they are engaging internationally in the area of climate, that would count as well, because climate change or climate warming, global warming, is not caused only in Switzerland. So action anywhere would count. And as a number of you will know, that already for the second time at the United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi in February, they proposed that they do more things about SRM, the whole category of solar radiation modification. And it was again turned down. They only had Monaco, Guinea, and some mini states supporting it, but most states turned it down. So one of the things that this ICCC would do, it would try to change that to help Switzerland with a broader coalition, both of course, United Nations members, so these are definitely sovereign states, but supported by local indigenous people in those states. Think the Sami in the Scandinavian country, think the Inuits in Alaska and in Canada, and like that work it up towards the government and to influence individual government positions, to actually bond into a wider coalition that wants to do what we want to do. Now, your question, Herb, what is our role? Well, if you indeed are representing, if I understand well, you know, a group of mostly scientists, well, obviously, science is extremely important. And also, I know quite a number of you have very big networks. Those networks are important as well. So I can definitely see a lot of potential for further cooperation. Of course, the degree at which we can do things will depend, of course, in part to our networks. Well, we have huge networks, both Wouter and myself, but also on the funding that we'll find, because I took a panel to Tokyo last year in March at the beginning of the Japanese G7 presidency, with Sir David King, with 4 times Prime Minister of the Netherlands, with somebody from Operatio Arctis, that's a kind of a youth Arctic movement from Scandinavia, myself. And when I was there, and because I speak Japanese, I went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and asked whether they don't have an Arctic ambassador, and it turned out they had one. And I persuaded him like 2 days before the conference to join our panel as well, because it would be a bit odd to have a panel in Tokyo and not a Japanese on the panel. Well, these things, of course, if you have to fly people over there, it's not just one overnight, you're staying there a couple of days and things like that. That was done a bit on a shoestring, and friends who funded this because they thought it was important to do, because Japan has a big problem. I don't know whether you're familiar with that list by the OECD that ranks countries.
Sorry,
OECD.
I'm going to interrupt you just because of time. This is fascinating stuff, and don't take my interruption to suggest.
No. Go ahead.
But I just want to make sure
I see lots of hands up for questions.
We have lots of hands up. I think what I would like to propose, and we talked about this maybe a little bit, for not for today, but for follow-up, is to see if we can actually work out some kind of memorandum of agreement, if you will, between HPAC and ultimately the ICCC, where we can start identifying specific areas that we can work together, how we can best communicate, and so forth, so that we can, operationalize this sort of early effort at creating a network between the two groups. But with that, I want to turn it over to Robert Chris, and then Aria, and then Robert Tulip, and then Ron.
You're on mute, Robert.
Mute, Robert.
Apologies. Right. Thank you very much. But, anyway, just to say, it's good to see you both again after, I think it's about a year we met in Cambridge. I got
Likewise.
2 questions. Let me ask them both, and then they're quite short, and you can answer one or both or neither. The first one is that however this kind of plays out, any form of effective cooling is going to cost trillions of dollars a year. I mean, we're talking serious money. And the first question is, do you see this funding coming primarily from the market, or do you see it coming primarily from government sources? In other words, effectively, one way or another, being funded by taxpayers around the world or businesses? That's the first question. And the second question is, I want to pick up on something that Wouter said at the very beginning of his contribution, which was that he had a difference of opinion with Donald Meadows about whether or not things had already deteriorated too far for us to rescue the situation. And I'd just be really interested if you could expand, Wouter, on what it is that Donald Meadows thinks is now unrescuable. Why does he think the collapse is now inevitable and it's irreversible? And on the other hand, in answering that, perhaps you could explain why you are, or how optimistic are you that he's wrong? I mean,
well, yeah, okay. It's good to see you also, Robert, again. We had a perfect prologue at dinner in Cambridge together about all this. The money is about a war economy. When the world is at war, then the normal financing systems don't work. So there is extra money and extra sources. Is a very different kind of financing. That's the talks with the ECB that we've started, the European Central Bank. It doesn't come from the market. It's out of the question. It has to come from different sources. And the comparison is the war economy. So that's a different ball game, and that's just still a long way to go. It's trillions of dollars. We don't know exactly where it goes to, but that's the way it goes. There's not a normal case. I give you an example. We had a meeting, Hans and I, with the former CEO of Shell, and he's a wonderful man. He's a good man. He's just retired, and he said, "I will try to find funding for you amongst my friends and peers." And a few weeks later, he came back and said, "Well, there's no business case, so there's no money from my side." And we said, "Jeroen, don't be so stupid, because it's not about business. This is a different ball game, and you do understand because you're very bright. So it's a different ball game. We don't know yet. That's a part of ICCC that we are going together. We are going to search to invent the different way of financing this." That's one. The other question was?
The other question was, what was the essence of the difference of opinion between you and Donald Meadows, that he
Okay.
thinks it is now irreversible towards collapse?
Okay. Dennis, of course, had dreams after the enormous success of limits to growth. He became famous. He became the number one scientist in the world. He was even suggested to get the Nobel Prize and all that. Dennis was very optimistic because he was a hero. But he doesn't see that in the meantime, after the war, we are Europeans, and you're a British. Well, I'm old enough to remember a few memories of the war. After the war, we have organized in the world thousands of organizations, world organizations. We've done that. And I told Dennis, look at that. These organizations are there and they work. And in every respect, think of very simple things as the internet. The internet is, of course, market driven, but it's a world organization. And so, Dennis, please don't think of ordinary world organizations, but think of the new formats of things that we already know. And that is Dennis doesn't have a look, and of course, and he's very ill, so he doesn't have the power anymore to be optimistic. So that's one. Dennis did his job, but that job is over.
Okay, Arya?
Well, maybe one thing, because we did, based on the plans of Stephen Salter and his estimates of about 700 of those unmanned ships on foils, we did do some design calculation with a big shipbuilder in the Netherlands, and we came more in the sort of the ballpark, or 10 to 20 million, 10 to 20 billion a year, not trillions a year. And I forgot how much of that was actually the building of the fleet, because once, of course, that has been built, they can operate for a number of years. Of course, you got the maintenance; they have to go back in because he has this system with cassettes, for filters, etc., etc. So it's not trillions; it's billions. But then again, you have to look at what's the cost of not doing it. That is far more expensive. And actually, 20 years ago, I was instrumental in helping to create a CO2 price that was the basis of the ETS, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which has now been adopted by many others. I will share after this phone call a paper where there is an analogy with something like called not biosphere or biotope credits. So what would, of course, be fantastic if there would be cooling credits. The problem, however, is with ETS, you just say 1 ton of CO2 is this much. How do you express a cooling credit? If you could, maybe that is something that you could work on. What could constitute a cooling credit, and how could you translate it to CO2? So could one cooling credit be worth 1.7 CO2 units? Because if you have that, then we could agree with all those big constituencies, the EU, the US, Australia. I think you've got an ETS system as well, but wherever that exists, you could then say, well, can we spend some money from that pot because we're bringing in this? So before we get to a war economy, there may be things that we can do to do the earlier science. But yes, indeed, in Dutch there's a saying, the one who burns his bum has to sit on blisters. Well, yes, that may indeed be the case. That will happen, but we should be working on both avoiding it, but probably will need some collateral damage before we get our case in order.
Okay, Arya.
Yes, thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank both of you for being here so much. And it's just so encouraging hearing both of you say everything you're saying. And my question specifically, and I want to make sure that I've got your name correct. Is it Hans, not Johannes?
Yeah. I apologize. I mean, for somehow Apple these days with all these identity verification, you have to show your password. So Johannes is my baptismal name, but you can make it John or Han or Hans or Johan or whatever. It's Hans, yes.
Okay, Hans, great, thank you. So first of all, I'm absolutely fascinated. Obviously, if you've got a background at Shell, I am incredibly fascinated by that personally, for many reasons. But so my question has to do with accountability and messaging and being able to really make an impact politically in relation to the fossil fuel industry and how much costs and damage and suffering that has been thrust on the entire rest of the planet as a result of that, imbalance in the system. So, I'm sure we're all very aware that that also connects with a lot of the resistance to these conversations about cooling, because people tend to think it's like a, get out of jail free card and that we're going to ignore the problem. I'm glad that you guys have enough understanding of the full system that we need to correct, and that you're not proposing cooling in an isolated bubble. But I do feel that if there is a sense of accountability, personal responsibility that is taken by the fossil fuel industry on the whole, in terms of solving this problem, that it is going to be easier to get buy-in from more people politically to move this forward.
Sorry, that is very true. And it's exactly the kind of steps that we are now exploring to get the fossil industry with us. And my story, my story yesterday to RWE, the largest German company in this respect, was if you don't take responsibility, you will lose. And I can prove why they will lose. They will lose their markets. They will lose their understanding. They will lose whatever. And the meeting was excellent. And today I got an invitation to go to Düsseldorf to explain it. And they understand. We had the meeting with the World Energy Council, largely 90% fossil fuel industry. We had a fantastic conference with the Shell alumni. Internet conference, 60,000 people. And all the time, the story was, you guys have to take responsibility. Once they do, and I expect they will, there will be heroes standing up in that industry and say, yes, I understand, we have to take responsibility. That will happen. I'm sure.
Right.
I'll give you an example. The chairman of Dow Chemicals Europe, he told us a few weeks ago that they are now constructing an experimental thorium reactor in Dallas or in Houston. And the story is, of course, connected. And we told him about what we are doing. And we said, there is a connection between your experiments and what we think is necessary. And he has the intellectual capacity and the social understanding to say, yes, you're right. We have to make it, build a bridge between the two.
So am I that is part of that responsibility? I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so am I to understand as part of that responsibility that they're agreeing to completely change their business model and to phase out what they're doing? Or are they just trying to continue with, oh, we're going to sequester enough carbon to, be okay?
They continue their business model for another few decades. We know that, because it's not possible to change the world machine just in a decade. That's impossible. And the other thing is, and something completely forgotten by most of us and the opponents, the resources for the new energy system are largely not there. A part of our intellectual program is the resource transition, which we do with the World 7 model, which is built in Oslo. And there we understand that the gap between what is needed in terms of renewables, something like 80 different materials, and what is needed and what's available and accessible, the gap is enormous. So they will all bounce against the brick wall. And that will be a major signal for everybody to change course. It's not there. So the business models will all change. They will all change, and also the financials under it will change. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay.
Ari, we only have a few minutes left. I want to try to get Robert, Tulip, and Ron and Greg quickly, at least. So if you could each just make your comment or ask your question as briefly as possible.
So,
Robert,
you can take
thank you,
you can
Hans.
take more minutes if you want to.
I'm sorry, what?
What was
You
that?
can take more minutes, Herb.
Okay, so we can go a little bit longer. So thank you, Hans, for mentioning the fact that emission reduction cannot substitute for direct climate cooling. It's a really important concept in terms of the aim to bring the balance back into the Earth system, as we discussed in the chat. And it's a message that I believe can be presented constructively to developing countries. And I was quite dismayed by the United Nations Environment Assembly rejection of the Swiss research proposal, and it illustrates the need to create a simple and acceptable message for developing countries. So I'm pursuing that with the Pacific Islands Forum, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on those themes.
I absolutely agree, Robert. And the beauty of how you said it in Cambridge, I mean, I've been using it. I mean, they're your lines, but I've been using that line many, many times because it's very clear to people. I mean, a variation to it is that, but maybe I can come back to an earlier comment, you know, why there's resistance. And people say, well, this will be taken as an excuse by notably the oil companies, but actually also by us consumers, that so there's another solution now, we can just go on doing what we do. Because of course, if you look at Raya, you probably may have heard of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. The bulk of the CO2 emissions is not done by the oil companies, it's by those that use the products of the oil companies, because it's in the combustion that you emit most of the CO2. And, you know, they have most of them have actually committed that by 2035 or 2040, they will reduce they will be net zero, but it's only for Scope 1 and Scope 2. Scope 3 is determined by the brain that actually decides on how deep the foot goes on the pedal, the accelerator, or where the finger goes on the thermostat, or the self-restraints in a web shop. I mean, I think it was Oxfam who made a very interesting graph whereby they actually allocated the CO2 emissions not where they are emitted, but by whom or on whose behalf they are emitted. And 50% of all the CO2 emissions are emitted on behalf of just 800 million people. That is the OECD countries. And we have successfully sort of offshored the dirty part to India and to China, but a lot of the Chinese emissions are actually our emissions, not their emissions, even though they emitted there. So what Wouter said is very important. There is this belief that renewable energy can be a substitute for fossil energy. Now, fossil is nothing else, but that's why it is called fossil, ancient solar energy. Multi-million years ancient solar energy. And renewables is trying to capture contemporary solar energy, the energy flows, rather than the stocks. And what the world has not yet understood, you cannot do with flows what you can do with stocks. And also, in order to, sun and wind obviously are free, but you need metals to capture it, then you need metals to convert it, then you need metals to store it, and you need metals to distribute it. And the think tank in Switzerland, where I now work for, we did a study in 2016, and just the bottom line of it was that 100 years ago, the average quality of copper ore in the world mined by the big mining companies was 2%. That means you had to take out 50 tons of ore to get 1 ton of copper. Today, it's 0.5%. So for the same 1 ton of copper, we now need to take out 200 tons of ore. And what will it be in 2050? I don't know, but it will be even less. But we are only at the eve of electrification. And many of the plans that our policymakers have will not happen because they cannot happen, physically speaking. So that the world will have to reduce what we call its energy metabolism is a no-brainer. Now, the good news is we are currently so inefficient that, of course, by sweeping out the inefficiency and only replace the net energy, that of course will help. But you know, if the world population will grow to 10 billion, and somebody mentioned the dilemma between the global north and the global south, there will be changes in lifestyle as well, but that is something that people do not want to hear.
Okay, Ron, your turn.
Thank you. So thank you, Hans and Wouter. We've been hearing about you for a long time. I'm part of the HPAC steering circle, and it's really great to to have this discussion with you, which I hope we will be able to continue. I just want to follow up on Herb's point about the nuts and bolts of this. I mean, we've been working very hard to build something that, that can sustain organizationally, move this effort forward that I think we all agree on, the urgency, the emergency need for direct climate cooling. I think there are some proposals. I think there, you appear to have many the ability to engage with funders and engage with folks in Europe in particular, that we are quite short on. We're trying to get our organization fiscally sponsored, which we hope will happen in June, and we're going to need to raise just small amounts of money. I'm talking, tens of thousands, not tens of millions or billions. And we could certainly, I think if we were able to collaborate our efforts, share our relative strong suits here, we might be able to do something, because I do think it's really important to have a real organization, to have something that, actually is sustainable. And we've been going for 3 years. We have, a website. We've all, we're trying to get our social media going. We need to do this. We would love to do this in collaboration with you and, the ICC or whatever. But I don't think, so that's basically my pitch on the government. I don't think we can wait for an ideal world governance for direct, and that's something in our paper. If you look at section 6, we talk about emerging governance, that has to be sort of synthetically in symbiosis with emerging cooling efforts. So I would really, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, to go through that, and I'm sure you have similar thoughts that we should go through. But if we could get something down, this meeting in Brussels we've been hearing about for a long time. I mean, if there was, if you have some actual concrete plans, I mean, we'd love to send I believe Herb has offered to attend such a meeting on our behalf. So I would just like to see some real concrete follow-up to this discussion. Thank you.
Any comments from the two of you? I'll second everything Ron said.
Wouter, did you hear?
Yeah, I heard it, but this was a fine contribution, and it confirms. But it's fine. Thank you. Wonderful. Of course, we will go forward along those lines.
It's very much, Ron. It's like walking. Walking is continuously nearly falling, and then put the other foot forward to prevent you fall, and then you risk again. You sway the weight forward, and you have to stop you from falling. That's what walking essentially is. And of course, we do have the networks because of Wouter even more years than I have. Not actually only in Europe, for me also in Japan, some in the US, in the UK, but it's still Europe in my mind. What we do lack is the funding. So obviously, the height at which we can fly will depend on how much fuel we'll get in the tank, or how big our wingspan will be, whatever analogy you want to have, a glider or a jet aircraft. So those are interlinked, obviously. On the other hand, success breeds success. And we also know that the time is now coming. I mean, you cannot have a debate, well, unless somebody has been living under a stone, that has to say, well, 52 degrees Celsius in India, all these torrential rains, what is happening? Well, of course, people don't know what's happening in the Arctic. I recommend you to have a look at the ICCC, just 2 C's website, and there's a film clip on there, and you can see the devastation that climate change is happening 4 to 5 times faster, as you know, there. They've got ice roads that are collapsing. They got home foundations that are collapsing because of melting ice. They cannot travel to the nearest city, 10,000 people to get fish tackle and gear. You know, they used to be able to do that from early September to late April, and now they can only do it from November till March. So they clearly feel this constraint. And so that is why I have good hopes in the short term that both with the ICC, we can get the indigenous people on board. On the other hand, with the Swiss, who got a problem now, and to bring it together and to score a first success. And then people will say, wait a sec, who actually brought Canada in here? And who did talk to the Inuits? And who happens to have these relationships in Bern with the Swiss government? Where did all that come from?
Hans, may I interrupt you there? Because there's another thing. The Inuits, they experience the degradation of their environment. So they act themselves. They start acting themselves. In the north of Europe, and the same in Canada, the permafrost of railways and roads is cracking and melting. So from there will be initiatives. And we have been requested by the government of Ghana to also there they experience now things like 52 degrees. The sea is boiling, fish are dying, the crops are collapsing, which means that from the real world there will be hundreds of initiatives based on all the trouble and all the accidents and all the experience that's going on. So we are not alone. We are not a gang fighting against an enormous enemy. That's not the case. There will be experience all over the world about all this. You may have known or heard that President Lula of Brazil has invited David to come to Brazil because of the floods there. That's a sign. The air conditioning in India is collapsing, and that's a sign. So our friends in India say there is now a movement starting in India along your lines because they cannot cope with it anymore. So we are not alone. There will be incidents and experiences all the time and cries for help. And what we have to do is prepare for help. And the scientific part and the technology part should fasten, should hurry up. We want you, we ask you, we beg you to come to conclusions as soon as possible. What is Robert about attacking companies, oil companies?
I wanted to ask Greg, who's had his hand up for quite a while. Greg, do you have a question?
Greg.
Well, I had two quick ones. One for our guests. One is the oil companies, the fossil companies, have long been accused from the outside of decades of stonewalling on climate, on proceeding with climate, any kind of action on climate. Where do they stand on active cooling, just generally speaking, from what you know? And secondly, to Wouter, the way you cast it, it seems like you expect almost a phase transition in the ability to get people on board, a sudden change that, you know, it's been going along. Everybody's been trying to do it for years, getting nowhere essentially, and you're expecting things are going to come to a head. Is that simply due to the fact that people are starting to suffer over the world? In which case, basically, it will be the way things always happen: is you wait for the catastrophe to start, and then governments are immediately under enormous pressure, and it's almost irrelevant who nobody's needed at that point, because the governments are running scared at that point, and they throw money at it, and they do everything, and they'll do the fastest thing, which I think will be SAI, but they will just do the thing that gives the quickest pain relief. But anyway, the question is, how do you see this sudden transition in cooperation? What is the driver?
It's not certain. You said you've been working on this for decades or for many years. But of course, the alarm bells were not ringing. And it was well done in the university and the academic world, but not in the outside world. I came across Stephen Solzer's work about 15 years ago, but I was the only one in my country. And I rang the bell, but nobody heard it because everybody was fascinated by the soon coming of solar panels and all that. But it takes time, of course, but it goes with a jump. All these developments are not gradually, but they go with jumps and accidents and whatever. So that's how things will happen in the years to come. We are now at the beginning of another hockey curve.
Okay.
I think
So
but
let
you
me
just, yeah.
Oh, you want to say something briefly, Hans? Go ahead.
No, just that the question asked is basically what Church already said in the Second World War. You have to bend the iron when it's hot. So you have to be ready. So what we need to do is to prepare and not wait until there will be a takers for what we want to do. We have to be prepared. And then when the takers will be, the situation will determine how much take up there will be for it. It's if you know my former McKinsey colleague Tom Peters, he wrote a book Surfing on Chaos. This is what that is. When you are surfing, you keep your eye on the point where you want to hit the beach, but you do not know what wave will come next or whether it will blow wind from the right or from the left. You just have to be prepared and try to remain standing in the way and ride the waves as they come. This is not going to be a beautiful Gantt chart-like planned project. It will be very much opportunistically taking opportunities that emerge and then use them in a smart way. But then able to do that, you have to be well prepared and well connected and well funded.
So I want to take your term and your metaphor about surfing and the sea and opportunistic and ask you a very tangible question. And I don't want to hold either of the two of you any longer, but I do want to ask you, we've got in 5.5 months, we've got COP29 coming up in Baku. And then we have a particularly important symbolically and maybe otherwise COP30 in Brazil the following year. And my question to you is, have you guys thought about or attempted to operationalize a strategy, recognizing there's lots of other institutions, it's not just COP, it's UNEA and Polar and all the rest, we've G20, et cetera. So I'm not suggesting all the eggs go into the COP basket, but do you have an emerging strategy or a defined strategy for what you would like to see achieved at this COP, and perhaps to build upon that for a more substantial success or victory at COP30?
It's a pity that Brazil is coming in 2 years' time. It will be COP30, of course. And your early question was, what wants the ICCC achieve in 3 years' time? So it would actually be the COP31. I don't even know by heart where that would be. But it would, of course, be fantastic if at COP30, which will be the culmination of the UAE Troika, because I don't know whether you know that there is a Troika organization between COP28, COP29, and COP30. If the Rio COP could be, because they will be revisiting the City of the Earth Summit, 1992 Earth Summit. So exactly. If you have got some sense of circularity, if the Rio Earth Summit could be repeated by COP30 in Rio again, and it could have the same allure as Kyoto had, but then for cooling. So what Kyoto did for emissions reduction, if Brazil COP30 could be that for cooling, that would be fantastic. But that's in 2 years' time. That is very ambitious. But I have spoken about this with David King. I think he's leaving Monday to go to Brasilia, where indeed, as Wouter said, we'll meet with Lula. And we did talk about precisely these things, because I said, well, since you're going there, maybe you can plant this idea in the minds of Lula, that for this COP coming back into the city where actually the idea was born, because you all know UNFCCC was agreed in Rio, and COP is the process that belongs to that. So would it be good if it comes back there, that actually we'll go from emissions to cooling?
Well, that's exactly why I asked you that question, because that's what I've been sort of thinking about. And I had seen an email from Dave King as well, where he seems to be focusing much of his strategic approach, or at least a good chunk of it, on COP30 in Brazil, which is, you say 2 years, but it's actually only 17 or 18 months. It's less than a year and a half. So,
You're
you know,
right.
that's good. That's good news, but it's also means we all have to start doing our planning and our politicking and our outreach to, countries and scientists and so forth. And let me just throw one other thing in that has come up at one of our working groups. We at HPAC have established a series of working groups on advocacy in the last couple of months or so. And one of them is on the Pacific Island, the small island states in the Pacific. And many of you, probably all of you, know Rafe Pomerantz. And Rafe has written about publicly and has talked about his approach or his goal and his wish to see if a sea rise limit can be incorporated as an amendment to the Paris Agreement that would accompany the temperature limits or so as a means of further, means of
Perfect idea.
What? I'm sorry. So anyway, this is something we were talking about in a meeting just a couple days ago or so. So what I'd like to be able to do is to make sure that your thoughts about 29 and 30 and our thoughts and those who are working with us, we can work really closely together on whatever it is we ultimately decide, obviously following the lead in many cases of people like Dave King and others who have, this extraordinary international, not just the international experience, but the messages they're going to hear back, or he's going to hear back from his meetings in Brazil and his meetings in China and all over the world.
Well, that's the idea of sea rise limit, Herb, is an excellent idea. That will give us an excellent instrument in our hands. I will work it out. Because the reason I am saying that, because I had made, I'm the envoy of a large dredging company. They are experienced in coastal defense and dike building and all that. The four biggest companies in dredging are Belgian and Dutch. And we had a model of 40,000 miles of coastal vulnerability, and the sea rise limit is not there. And I can include that, and that will be a major instrument. Okay, so that's suddenly I'm very inspired. Thank you.
And I don't have, because I'm speaking here, I don't have the ability to find the Foreign Affairs article that he and Alice Hill from the Council on Foreign Relations wrote. I believe it was published in April of 2023. But if you Google it, you should be able to find it, or maybe somebody else can put it in the chat before we wrap up, or we'll send it to you.
Okay.
First, he first floated that idea publicly, and he's now engaged. There is, for example, a UN General Assembly meeting September 25th, that an all-day meeting, as I understand it, that's devoted just to sea level rise. So there are opportunities to be able to, and that may fit into the work you're doing with Ghana and other entities. And this is the kind of cross-fertilization that I think we need to find ways that we are in touch on a regular basis so we can share these ideas and support each other wherever and whenever we can. Because, I think the bottom line is whatever minor differences we may have in emphasis in terms of technologies or temperature reductions and whatever, the overall target and goal and sensibility that these two entities, our entity and your entity, has are, almost completely, in sync with each other, I think. And so I'm really thrilled that the two of you are here. I give you my appreciation for staying up so late. I know Hans told me when the meeting began, you had to wheel your mother around in a wheelchair all day long, so you're probably eager to hit the sack. We look forward to working with you in the future. If anyone else, will let the two of you go. If others want to stay on and debrief from this, we're happy to do so.
I just want to interject something really quickly. I feel like it would be so important to forge an introduction. Are they in connection with Rafe yet? Because you guys should
Well,
be
that's easy
talking.
enough to do. I can take care of
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Make sure.
Yeah, good
One
idea.
last-
Oh, and I want to,
Herb?
this is Peter Fikowski. I just
Hi,
came
Peter.
on at the
Good to see
very
you,
tail
Peter.
end. So I just
All
want
right.
to say hello. And thank you guys for organizing this. And I will look forward to the recording.
Well,
Okay.
I have one last.
Anyone? Go ahead, Wouter.
If anyone feels that he really needs to be there in Brussels, I suppose you are still coming, Herb, are you?
Well, we'll talk afterwards. I was planning on coming.
Well,
I heard
the point is-
another message yesterday, but we can talk about that. I can
Well,
be there if there's something to go to that's worthy of attending, which
Ma-
it sounds like there
my
is.
my invitation is if anyone of our group here is eager to come to Brussels, let me know.
And
Okay.
Wouter,
Well, thank you with
maybe
that.
it's good to share that there will be 2 or 3 meetings. So the first one will be on the 21st of June, but we're also looking for a meeting in September and perhaps in November. And I've got some homework to do that I promised to a few of you to sort of help John Nissen to convert his very good letter to Ambassador Redley, the Swiss ambassador representing Switzerland in the United Nations Environment Assembly, to basically convert it from asks into offers so that we offer them help. And by the way, it's John who decides what letter goes out. It's just a suggestion that I'll make. But if that letter would be sent before the summer, I could envisage that when we organize our second meeting in Brussels, perhaps in September, Herb, for you to remember, that by that time, we could consider if you could come to the second meeting, that you then also stay on and join us for a visit to Bern in the ministry, because by then we hope to have had a relationship there for further operation. And then we could have a Brit, and you would be an American, and I am living in Switzerland, and Wouter as a European. We could go with 4 of us and make a representation in person to the Ministry of Environment in Switzerland and say, well, look, we've had this exchange of letters, but this is who we are. Look at what kind of network and geography we represent. Okay, we do not have Asia. That might be a good thing to do as well. But Wouter, you know the other 2 dates, right, Wouter? I only know the 24th precisely, but there will be 2 more events. So Herb, then,
Yep.
unless you want to combine it with the Green Week in London,
I will let everybody know
Good. Yeah.
by mail.
Okay. Okay, I want to thank everybody. And I also want to acknowledge that in addition to Rafe working on sea level rise, I know you've been working area with him, which is, I'm sure, why you raised that, because of your strategic location in a state that some of you may have heard of. It's called Florida. And the folks down there have just prohibited the use of the term climate change at the same time that sea level rise is on the way to ravaging that home of many tens of millions of people. So with that, again, I thank the 2 of you. I'll let you guys go. We'll stay on for a very few minutes. And it was a great session today, and we'll have many more. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Herb.